Alma Holloway jolted awake to the sound of gunshots ripping through the cold, brittle air. Her hand reached instinctively for the rifle propped beside her bed, fingers curling around the worn, familiar grip. Sweat clung to her brow, the cool of the night already forgotten, as she pushed herself upright and strained to listen beyond the thunder of her own heartbeat. The horses came first, hooves drumming the earth like the roll of an approaching storm, muffled voices straining through. The darkness. They were out there again, men with shadows for faces and cruelty for purpose, and they were coming for her. Alma's cabin, a small, stubborn structure she'd patched and rebuilt over the years, trembled as if it shared her fear. The roof still leaked in heavy rain, and the floorboards creaked under her steps. But it was hers. It was all she had left, and she would defend it until her last breath. She crept to the window, eyes sharp and accustomed to the dark. Shapes loomed in the distance, figures circling like vultures. She recognized their crude bravado, their laughter coarse and taunting, already celebrating a victory they hadn't earned. The Black Creek Gang had been harassing her for weeks, their reasons as unclear as their intentions were lethal. The first time they'd come, they'd made their threats plain enough. Hand over the map or face the consequences. She'd laughed them off then as best she could, told them she didn't have any map worth stealing. But the words had tasted hollow even to her. They hadn't believed her, and worse, she couldn't blame them. Alma's late husband, Samuel, had died rambling about gold veins and buried riches, fevered dreams that had taken hold in his final days. He'd spoken of a mine somewhere deep in the northern hills, its location etched in his memory like scripture. But the sickness had twisted his thoughts, left him grasping at shadows and muttering about the wealth he'd never found. Alma had never seen any map, never found anything but dirt and disappointment when she dug through his old things. But the Black Creek Gang didn't care about her truth. They cared about gold, real or imagined, and they were convinced she held the key to it. Her jaw tightened as she peered into the darkness, rifle steady in her hands. Their numbers had grown since the last time. 6 or 7 by her count. 2, many to scare off with a warning shot. Too many to face head-on. But if she made them bleed, made the cost of chasing ghosts too steep, maybe they'd finally leave her be. She sucked in a breath and fired. The shot cracked like lightning, cutting through their laughter. A yell followed, startled and angry, but not wounded. Alma cursed under her breath and fired again. This time she heard the gratifying thud of a bullet meeting flesh, a strangled cry echoing through the night. "Crazy old bitch," one of them shouted. "Ain't got to be like this," but it did. They'd made sure of that. Alma kept her rifle trained on the dark shapes, her finger twitching over the trigger. Her shoulders ached with the weight of the gun, her eyes burning from lack of sleep. But she would not back down. Not tonight. The horses scattered, the men barking at one another to regroup. The gang wasn't running, not truly, but they weren't charging her door either. They'd underestimated her, thought her some feeble widow guarding a worthless patch of land. Let them keep thinking that. Let them underestimate her all they wanted. She fired again, this time toward the ground near their feet, sending dirt, flying. More shouts, more curses. But finally the hoofbeats receded, the night thickening with silence once more. Alma lowered her rifle, her hands trembling now that the danger had passed. Her throat felt raw, her breathing ragged. Outside, the night settled back into its usual quiet, but Alma could still feel their presence lingering like smoke. They'd be back. Of that she had no doubt. She bolted the door, then went to inspect the damage. 2 bullets had punched through the cabin walls, leaving ugly scars in the wood. She ran her fingers over the splintered holes, her mouth tightening. They were getting bolder, desperate. Morning broke reluctantly, dragging weak sunlight over the horizon. Alma was already awake, coffee boiling on the stove as she moved through her chores with mechanical efficiency. The soreness in her muscles had deepened overnight, but she pushed through it. Her hands trembled as she worked, though she couldn't be sure if it was exhaustion or something darker. The barn stood some 20 yards from the cabin, its weather-beaten boards creaking under the steady pressure of the wind. She hadn't even made it to the door before her steps slowed, eyes narrowing. There, scrawled across the broad wooden planks, was a symbol she'd never seen before, a rough, charred mark burned into the wood. a circle bisected by a jagged line. The edges were blackened, the smell of scorched timber clinging to the air like something rotten. It wasn't a message, it was a warning. Alma traced the outline with a trembling finger. The gang had left their mark, a declaration of their intent. They weren't just harassing her, they were hunting her. She forced herself to take a breath, to think they'd come again soon and in greater numbers. The rifle alone wouldn't be enough. She needed a plan, something that would give her more than the fleeting advantage of surprise. But as she turned to head back to the cabin, her foot caught on something half buried in the dirt. She knelt and unearthed a fragment of metal, old and tarnished but unmistakably shaped. A coin dulled by years of neglect. Her heart gave a painful lurch. Samuel's treasure, or just another false lead? Either way, it wouldn't matter if she didn't live long enough to figure it out. The next night they returned. They shouted taunts from the tree line, their words slurred by whiskey and arrogance. Alma kept her rifle close but didn't fire. Not yet. Let them come closer. Let them believe she'd lost her nerve. Hand it over, lady, we know it's here. One voice hollered, gravelly and mean. Ain't no use in hiding it. She watched them from the darkened cabin, her fingers tracing the rifle's barrel. They didn't realize how well she could see them, their forms lit dimly by the moon's pale glow. They also didn't know she'd prepared traps along the perimeter, crude snares and pitfalls she'd spent the afternoon digging. She'd made herself a fortress from dust and desperation. She allowed herself one last deep breath before firing. This time her aim was true. A scream tore through the night, followed by a frantic scramble of footsteps. But still, they didn't leave. They lingered at the edges of her property, shouting threats, promises of vengeance. And through it all, Alma remained steadfast, eyes fixed on the darkness. Because she knew deep down that this was only the beginning. The morning after the latest attack, Alma was up before the sun, her hands stiff and swollen from gripping the rifle all night. Sleep had been fitful and fragmented, but she couldn't afford to let weariness slow her down. As the first light crept over the hills, she walked the perimeter of her homestead, boots crunching over loose gravel and dry, brittle grass. The traps she'd set the previous afternoon were undisturbed, save for one that had snared a scrawny rabbit, now lying still and lifeless. She crouched, cutting the creature free, but her eyes remained fixed on the distance, searching for any sign of movement. They would come back, they always did. But she wouldn't be caught off guard. Not again. She was skinning the rabbit when she heard it, the sound of slow, deliberate hoofbeats on the path leading up to her cabin. Her hands stilled, heart thumping against her ribs. With a cautious glance toward the approaching figure, she let the knife slip back into its sheath and wrapped her fingers around the rifle's stock instead. The rider appeared around the bend, moving at a steady pace. Dust kicked up under the horse's hooves, a tired palomino with a weary gait. The man in the saddle sat tall, his shoulders squared, and his wide-brimmed hat pulled low over his face. He didn't seem in a hurry, but there was an air of purpose about him, like he'd already made up his mind about whatever business had brought him to her doorstep. Alma stepped forward, rifle angled but not raised. "Who are you, and what do you want?" Her voice came out steadier than she felt. The man tipped his hat back, revealing a face roughened by wind and sun. His beard was trimmed close, though flecked with grey, and his eyes, cool and clear, met hers without flinching. He wasn't a young man, but there was strength in his frame, a kind of wiry resilience. "Name's James Callahan," he said, voice low and even. "Heard about the trouble you've been having. Thought I might offer some help." Alma tightened her grip on the rifle. "You from town?" "No, ma'am. Got a spread of my own a few miles west. Don't come into town much. But word travels. Folks are saying the Black Creek boys got their sights set on your place." She gave a curt nod. "They've already tried, didn't work out for them." James glanced at the bullet holes in the cabin's walls, his expression unreadable. "Looks like you gave them a scare. Trouble is, men like that don't spook easy. They'll come back, likely meaner." "Why do you care?" Alma challenged, not lowering her rifle. He shifted in the saddle, his posture relaxed despite the tension. "Maybe I don't. Maybe I just don't like seeing good folks run off their own land. Besides, I've crossed paths with Jed Crawford before. Man's a snake, Puts on a big show, but when push comes to shove, he'll take whatever's not nailed down. The name hit her like a slap. Crawford, that was the leader's name, the one who kept barking orders from the shadows. Alma bit back a curse. Why help me? James hesitated, his eyes narrowing as if weighing his words. Used to wear a badge, back in Arizona. Learned real quick the kind of men who don't stop until they've chewed up everything in their path. Lost folks to men like that don't aim to see it happen again. The silence stretched between them, Alma's mind racing. Trust was a luxury she couldn't afford, but something about his tone, his unhurried way of speaking, eased the knot. In her chest just a little. Don't suppose you got a plan, she ventured. He swung down from the saddle, boots crunching against the ground. First steps making this place harder to take. They think you're an easy mark. Time we prove. Them wrong. Alma frowned but didn't object. Instead, she watched as James walked the perimeter, his keen eyes catching things she hadn't noticed. A weak spot in the fence, a window left unlatched. He nodded to himself, speaking more to the air than to her. They'll come at night. Reckon they'll try to smoke you out next time. Her jaw tightened. I've seen how they move. You think we can stop them? He looked back at her, a faint, almost grim smile tugging at the corner of his mouth. Ain't about stopping. It's about making them think twice. Men like Crawford don't want a fight. They want easy pickings. We make it clear that this ain't worth the trouble. They worked through the day. Alma found herself following James's instructions, reinforcing doors and barricading windows, creating narrow lines of sight where she could defend without being easily seen. James fashioned makeshift barriers from spare wood, arranging them to funnel any attackers into a single exposed path. During a break, they shared a meager meal of jerky and boiled coffee. Alma wasn't much for conversation, but James didn't press her. He spoke sparingly, his gaze often drifting to the horizon, as if expecting trouble to ride in at any moment. What's your story? Alma asked finally, breaking the quiet. He didn't answer right away, his hand resting on the rifle he'd brought from his own place. Used to think I could make a difference, wore that badge like it meant something. Then one day, a gang came through, a lot like this one. Took my wife, my daughter, burned my home. I went after them. Killed some. Most got away, never found the rest. Badge didn't matter after that. Alma studied his face, seeing the lines carved deep by grief and time. She didn't offer words of comfort. She knew they wouldn't mean much. Instead, she nodded, a gesture of understanding. That night, as darkness swallowed the valley, they sat side by side, rifles in hand, eyes trained on the edges of the property. James spoke quietly, his voice just above a whisper. You've got something they want. Whether it's real or not don't matter. As long as they think it's here, they'll keep coming. Then what? We make sure they don't leave. Silence fell again, thick and tense. Alma listened to the night, the wind rattling the cabin's windows. Her pulse beat in time with the creaks and groans of the wooden walls, and beside her, James remained motionless, his presence a quiet reassurance. The first shout rang out from the tree line, followed by the flicker of torches. Shadows moved, spreading out. James glanced at her, and she saw the determination in his eyes, calm and unwavering. They moved to their positions, Alma taking the loft while James stayed near the front door, rifle at the ready. The gang didn't charge, not at first. They hollered threats, taunting Alma, trying to coax her out. James signaled for her to wait, to let them draw closer. She felt her hands sweat against the rifle's stock, every fiber in her body tense. Then, one of them took a step too far into the open, and James fired, the sharp crack of his rifle tearing through the night. A man fell, cursing, and the gang scattered, momentarily caught off guard. Alma took her chance, picking off another who tried to circle wide. The chaos lasted only minutes, but when the smoke cleared, the gang had retreated, dragging their wounded with them. James lowered his rifle, breathing steady while Alma watched. The path disappear into darkness. They'll be back, she said quietly. He nodded, wiping the sweat from his brow. Ain't over yet, but they'll think twice before trying again tonight. For the first time in days, Alma felt a flicker of hope, fragile but real. She glanced at James, grateful and wary all at once. As they settled back into their watchful silence, She couldn't help but think that maybe, just maybe, she wasn't facing this fight alone anymore. Morning broke pale and sullen, the sky thick with clouds that threatened rain, but refused to yield. Alma stirred from a shallow sleep, her head cradled against the rough wooden wall of the cabin's loft. Her body protested as she straightened, each joint stiff and aching from the night's vigil. Below her, James was already awake, moving, with the same deliberate efficiency she'd come to recognize as his nature. He didn't speak much, but his actions spoke for him, steady and reliable as the earth beneath her feet. They shared breakfast in silence, a meager portion of dried meat and black coffee. The air was thick with the scent of gunpowder and sweat, a sharp reminder of the previous night's skirmish. The Black Creek gang had retreated, but not without leaving a fresh scar across her land. Their taunts still echoed in her mind, their words steeped in greed and fury. James glanced at her from across the room, his eyes dark and searching. "You need to rest," he said, his voice flat but not unkind. "You keep pushing yourself like this, you'll break before they do." Alma bristled at the suggestion. "Can't afford to rest. Not while they're still out there." His gaze didn't waver. "They'll come back, sure, but you're not doing yourself any favors burning the candle at both ends." She met his eyes, her own gaze sharp and unyielding. "Maybe I break before they do, but I'll make sure I take some of them down with me." The corner of his mouth twitched, not quite a smile, but something close. "Stubborn as a mule," he muttered. "But I reckon that's kept you alive. This long." The quiet settled between them like a heavy fog, broken only by the distant calls of birds and the faint creak of wood underfoot. Alma had grown accustomed to the silence, had come to rely on it as both shield and weapon. But James's presence was different, his calmness unsettling in its persistence. The day wore on in uneasy stillness. Alma busied herself with chores, her hands moving with the practiced precision of habit. The barn needed mending, the roof patched where the last storm had torn shingles loose. She climbed the ladder with her hammer and nails, fingers trembling, only slightly as she drove the metal into the wood. Below, James was working on reinforcing the fence line, his broad shoulders bent over the task with the same tireless focus he applied to everything. Watching him work, Alma couldn't help but feel a pang of gratitude mixed with suspicion. His help was welcome, but she couldn't shake the sense that he was holding something back. It was late afternoon when she saw him pause, his hands gripping the post he'd just finished securing. His gaze was distant, his expression clouded by something darker than fatigue. "What is it?" she called down, her voice sharper than she'd intended. He looked up, his eyes narrowing against the sun's fading glare. "I need to head into town," he said. "Running low on ammunition, and there's something I need to check on." Alma felt her chest tighten. "You're leaving?" "Not for long. Just need a day, maybe two." "What if they come back while you're gone? Then you'll do what you've been doing all along." His tone was matter-of-fact, but there was something else beneath it, something that twisted Alma's nerves into knots. "You've proven you can handle yourself. I wouldn't leave otherwise." The word stung, though she couldn't quite say why. She wanted to snap at him, to tell him she didn't need him or his concern, but she bit the words back, her pride warring with practicality. "When are you leaving?" she asked instead. "Tomorrow morning." The rest of the day passed in strained silence. Alma kept herself busy, her hands moving with frantic energy even as her mind churned with doubt. She told herself it didn't matter whether James stayed or left. She'd survived worse than this. She'd face whatever came her way alone if she had to. That night, as the wind howled around the cabin and the stars flickered faintly through the clouds, Alma found herself unable to sleep. The unease gnawed at her, a constant nagging presence that refused to be silenced. She slipped from her bed, her bare feet whispering against the cold wood floor. James was awake, sitting by the dying fire, his rifle across his lap. He looked up as she approached, his gaze steady but unreadable. "Couldn't sleep?" he asked. Alma shook her head. "Too quiet." "Funny. Most people'd kill for some peace and quiet." "Peace and quiet don't mean the same thing out here," she replied, her voice roughened by fatigue. "Silence just means something's waiting to strike." James nodded, his expression softening. "You're not wrong, but sometimes you have to take the quiet when you can. Otherwise, You'll drive yourself mad." They sat in silence, the fire's embers painting their faces in hues of amber and shadow. Alma studied his features, searching for something she couldn't quite name. "You said you used to be a lawman," she ventured. "Why'd you give it up?" He hesitated, his fingers tracing the smooth wood of the rifle. "Thought I could make a difference. Turns out I was just putting out fires while the whole damn forest was burning. Lost my family to a gang out in Arizona. Went after them, spent years chasing ghosts. Badge didn't help. Justice didn't matter. Only thing that kept me going was the idea that maybe, just maybe, I could make someone else's world a little safer." Alma felt the weight of his words settle over her like a blanket made of lead. "So, this is penance?" "Maybe." His gaze flicked toward her, something hard and haunted in his eyes. "Or maybe it's just the only thing I know how to do anymore." They lapsed into silence again, the unspoken words thickening the air between them. Alma wanted to ask him to stay, to help her face the danger she knew was closing in, but the words wouldn't come. Pride or fear, she couldn't say which kept her mouth shut. When dawn came, she watched him ride off with the same sense of foreboding she'd felt when the Black Creek gang had first appeared on her land. The emptiness left in his wake was almost unbearable, a wound she hadn't expected to feel. The day passed slowly, each minute dragging like iron chains. Alma worked herself to exhaustion, her hands raw and bleeding from the effort. But no amount of labor could quiet the storm raging inside her. That night, as darkness claimed the land once more, she sat alone by the fire, her rifle clutched tight against her chest. She kept her ears trained on the silence, her nerves frayed and snapping under the strain. It was near midnight when she heard it, the faint, deliberate creak of a floorboard. Her breath caught, her muscles locking into place. Someone was inside. The realization hit her like a fist to the gut. They'd come while James was gone, just as she'd feared, and she was alone. She rose to her feet, her rifle aimed at the shadows. But the darkness held its secrets close, the silence mocking her with its indifference. Alma felt the familiar heat of rage swell within her, burning away the terror. They'd taken everything from her, her home, her peace, her sanity. But she still had her fight, and she wasn't about to give that up. She braced herself, her fingers curling around the trigger, her eyes narrowed against the darkness. If they wanted her, they'd have to come and take her, and she intended to make them bleed for every inch. The night crept in, thick and oppressive, smothering the land with a chill that sank deep into Alma's bones. Her nerves thrummed with a sharp, agitated energy as she paced the cabin's narrow confines. The shadows pressed against the walls, stretching and twisting like dark hands trying to claw their way inside. She had barricaded the door, reinforced the windows, and set traps where she could. But all her preparations felt as flimsy as paper against the storm she knew was gathering. Alone, she was a splinter fighting a wildfire, her defenses a mockery of what real strength might have been. And James wasn't coming back. A sound broke the silence. A rustling outside, the faint creak of wood under careless boots. They were here. Again, Alma pressed her back against the wall, her rifle clutched tight to her chest. Her breath came fast and shallow, eyes darting toward every creak, every whisper of sound. Her cabin had become a cage, each corner a trap of her own making. She squeezed her eyes shut, forcing herself to breathe, to focus. They had come for her before, and failed. But this time she could sense their determination, the hunger that drove them. The lure of gold, real or imagined, had twisted their minds, turned them into rabid animals, and like animals, they would not stop until they had torn her world apart. She caught a glimpse of movement through the narrow slit of a window, a shadow slipping between trees, then another. They were spreading out, circling her home like wolves. Her fingers tightened around the rifle's grip, her muscles coiled and ready. The first gunshot tore through the night, splintering wood and ricocheting off the metal hinges of the door. Alma ducked low, her heartbeat a wild staccato rhythm. In her ears, they were testing her, probing for weakness. She wouldn't give them the satisfaction. The second shot came from the left, rattling the window pane nearest the stove. Glass shattered, raining down in jagged shards. Alma rolled away from the blast, her body moving on instinct alone. Her rifle barked in response, the sharp crack punctuating the air. A scream followed, raw and guttural, cut off by a flurry of cursing. She had hit one of them. Good. Let them. Bleed more shots. The cabin trembled under the assault, walls groaning as bullets punched through like angry fists. Alma returned fire, aiming toward the flickers of movement outside, her breaths short and savage. They were getting closer, their confidence bolstered by numbers. Voices rang out, taunts and threats thrown like stones against her resolve. She caught snippets of their words, each one a lash against her fraying composure. "Give it up, lady. We know you got the map. Hand it over and we might let you live. Burn her out. Say if she won't come out, we'll smoke her like a rat." The last voice twisted Alma's stomach into knots. It was Jed Crawford. She recognized his oily drawl, the arrogance that dripped from every syllable. He was here, personally leading the attack. That meant they were serious. They were done toying with her. Alma fired again, driving them back. The recoil jolted her shoulder, the pain reminding her she was still alive. Her ears rang with the echo of the shot, but she forced herself to keep moving, reloading with fingers made clumsy by fear. The flames started small, a faint orange glow flickering at the edges of the barn. They had torched her outbuildings first, testing her reaction, trying to smoke her out. The fire crackled and hissed, the dry wood catching and spreading with ruthless efficiency. Alma felt her chest tighten, panic clawing at her throat. She had prepared for a siege, for gunfire and brute force, but fire was different. Fire was merciless, devouring everything without hesitation. She scrambled to the window, her gaze locked on the growing blaze. Shadows danced wildly against the inferno, men moving like demons conjured from hell itself. They were laughing now, their voices rising above the roar of the flames. Alma's hands trembled as she reloaded, her breath coming in sharp, shallow bursts. She was outnumbered, outgunned, and the fire was creeping closer with every passing second. And still she fought. Her rifle spat death into the darkness, the muzzle flash lighting her grim expression. She heard another cry, another body hitting the ground. It should have satisfied her, but it didn't. Nothing would. Not until this nightmare ended. The fire crept toward the cabin, its heat pressing against the walls like a living thing. Smoke seeped through the cracks, its acrid stench filling her lungs. Coughing, she stumbled backward, her eyes watering. She heard the crunch of footsteps approaching the door, heavy, deliberate. Someone was coming for her directly. No more games. The door shuddered under the impact of a booted foot. Once, twice. On the third kick, the wood splintered inward, pieces scattering across the floor. Alma raised her rifle, the barrel steady even, as her vision swam. Jed Crawford stepped through the wreckage, his expression smug and triumphant. His revolver gleamed in the dim light, aimed squarely at her chest. "Well, well," he drawled, his voice a cruel rasp. "You put up quite a fight, old woman. But the game's over. Hand over that map and maybe I'll let you crawl out of here alive." "There is no map," Alma spat, her voice hoarse but defiant. "You're chasing ghosts," he laughed, the sound harsh and grating. "Don't much care if it's real, or not. Long as you're out of the way, the land's ours to dig up and plunder. Now be a good little lady and toss that rifle to the floor." She didn't move. Her finger remained on the trigger, her gaze locked on his. "You want this land, you'll have to bury me in it." Jed's eyes narrowed, his smile curdling into a snarl. "Have it your way." He fired, the sound thunderous, within the confines of the cabin. Pain exploded in Alma's side, white-hot and searing. She staggered but didn't fall. With a scream torn from somewhere deep and primal, she pulled the trigger. Jed stumbled backward, blood blooming across his chest. His eyes widened in shock, disbelief etched into his features. He dropped to his knees, his gun clattering to the floor. Alma swayed, her vision swimming. Blood trickled from her wound, hot and sticky against her skin. She stumbled to the doorway, her legs trembling beneath her weight. Outside, the gang was scattered, their courage broken by the death of their leader. The fire was spreading, licking hungrily at the cabin's walls. Alma limped toward the safety of the trees, her breath coming in ragged gasps. She collapsed against the cool earth, her fingers digging into the dirt as if to anchor herself to the world. Then she heard it, the sound of hooves pounding against the ground. Her vision blurred, but she recognized the silhouette, the familiar outline of a man riding hard toward her. James. He dismounted and rushed to her side, his voice urgent, his hands steady as he checked her wound. She tried to speak, but the words tangled in her throat. His hands holding her. Easy, his voice cutting through the haze. You're going. She had survived. To be all right, I'm here. But Alma's eyes drifted shut, her body sinking into the darkness. The wind howled over the cracked earth, sweeping dust into the air like some restless, invisible beast. Jed Thompson stood on the porch of his weather-beaten cabin, his rough hands gripping the railing, his gaze fixed on the horizon where the sun dipped low, painting the sky in streaks of gold and crimson. Evenings like these were when the loneliness clawed deepest, when the quiet stretched out so far it felt like he might fall into it and never return. The creak of a loose board brought him back, his son's small voice breaking the silence. "Pa, dinner ready yet?" Tommy's blonde hair stuck out in tousled tufts, his cheeks smudged with dirt from playing near the chicken coop. Jed forced a smile, though it didn't reach his eyes. "Soon, son. Just need to check the traps." He glanced down at the boy, so full of life despite all they'd lost. Tommy was all he had left now, his last thread to something like happiness. His wife Sarah had been gone 2 years, taken by fever that swept through the town with a merciless hand. He'd buried her on the hill beyond the cabin, beneath a willow whose branches swayed as if in mourning. They survived, though just barely. Jed did his best to keep the farm running, but it had been falling to pieces long before Sarah died. Livestock died off, crops failed more often than not, and the relentless drought left the soil as brittle as his resolve. What few dollars he earned came from odd jobs in town, breaking horses or mending fences for men better off than himself. He rarely went to town except for supplies. Folks there had been kind enough during Sarah's illness, but pity turned to impatience when he failed to bounce back to his old reliable self. He saw it in their eyes. Expectation hardened into disdain. Jed Thompson, the man who used to laugh louder than anyone at the saloon, reduced to a grim shadow, working himself into the ground. Jed's boots crunched against the gravel as he made his way toward the traps set along the edge of his property. His rifle lay heavy over his shoulder, more habit than necessity. He had learned the hard way that coyotes didn't respect boundaries, much like the debt collectors who would soon come knocking if he didn't find a way to pay off what he owed. Returning to the cabin with 2 scrawny rabbits, he started a fire and roasted them over the hearth. The scent of charred meat filled the small room, mingling with the dusty, stale air. Tommy ate greedily, chattering about his day, his imagination spinning grand tales of cowboys and bandits. Jed listened, nodding along, his responses little, more than grunts of acknowledgement. That night, as Tommy drifted to sleep beneath a worn blanket, Jed sat by the fire, eyes hollow and fixed on the dying embers. The ache of Sarah's absence never dulled, just changed shape, settling into his bones like an old injury. The thought of finding someone new felt like betrayal, yet the weight of solitude threatened to crush him if he didn't find a way to share the burden. A pounding on the door jolted him awake, though he hadn't realized he'd been dozing. The sun had yet to rise, the world outside painted in shades of ink and shadow. Tommy stirred but didn't wake, his breathing soft and even. Jed opened the door to find Old Man Higgins standing on the porch, his grey beard and tattered hat covered in a thin layer of dust. Higgins ran the livery and had a knack for knowing everyone's business, whether they wanted him to or not. "Jed," the old man rasped, his voice like gravel, "you best come down to the station." "There's a bit of a spectacle brewing," Jed frowned. "What's it got to do with me?" Higgins scratched at his chin. "A bride came in on the morning train. Trouble is, the man who was supposed to meet her never showed. Left her stranded. And folks are, well, they're being their usual gracious selves." Jed hesitated. He had no desire to get tangled in someone else's mess, but something in Higgins's tone gave him pause. "Why come to me about it?" Jed asked, his voice tight with suspicion. "Because you ain't like the rest of them," Higgins replied. "And because I reckon you might want to see for yourself before things get worse." Curiosity mixed with a reluctant sense of duty pulled Jed from the cabin, leaving Tommy still asleep. The town's train station was little more than a wooden platform, and a shack where the stationmaster kept the schedules and sorted freight. A small crowd had gathered, their voices rising with sharp-edged laughter. As Jed approached, he saw her, Maggie Mayfield. She stood near her trunks, shoulders hunched as if bracing against a storm. She was large, yes, but not just in the way that made her an easy target for the cruel remarks tossed her way. There was a solidity to her, a presence that made Jed feel small and hollow by comparison. Too fat for her own good, that one, someone sneered from the crowd. Can't believe any man would want her. She'll eat him out of house and home, another jeered, spitting tobacco into the dust. Maggie kept her chin high, her gaze fixed straight ahead, but Jed saw the hurt in her eyes, sharp and raw as an open wound. He watched her for a moment, longer, torn between turning away and stepping forward. Pity stirred something else in him, a flicker of anger at the cruelty these townsfolk wielded so easily. He cleared his throat. "What's the trouble here?" The crowd shifted, eyes narrowing as they recognized him. Jed had never been one for meddling, but he couldn't bring himself to walk away this time. "No trouble, Jed," Higgins answered from somewhere in the throng. "Just a woman waiting for a man who ain't ever coming." Maggie's eyes met his, the defiance there barely masking the hurt. Jed could see she was trying to keep herself together, but the strain was evident. He glanced at her trunks. 2 large battered cases, and a satchel that looked about ready to burst at the seams. "Where you planning on going?" Jed asked her, ignoring the whispers and snickers from the crowd. Her voice was strong, but Jed could hear the tremor beneath the surface. "I was promised a place here. A fresh start. Seems that was a lie." He nodded slowly. "And you've got nowhere else to go?" "Nowhere at all," she admitted, her shoulders slumping under the weight of her own words. Jed scratched at his beard, feeling the eyes of the crowd burning into him like hot coals. He didn't owe this woman anything. Hell, he could barely keep himself and Tommy fed. But something about her, the way she refused to buckle under the weight of their scorn, stirred an old instinct in him. "I've got a place," he said, his words surprising even himself. "A bit run down, but you're welcome to stay until you figure out your next move." The shock on her face quickly gave way to suspicion. "Why would you do that?" Jed shrugged. "Because I know what it's like to have nowhere left to go." Higgins chuckled from behind him. "Well, ain't that a sight? Jed Thompson taking in a stray." The crowd began to disperse, their interest fading now that the spectacle was over. Maggie looked at Jed, her eyes searching his face for any hint of cruelty or deceit. Finding none, she nodded, her voice steadier than before. "I thank you, Mr. Thompson, truly." "It's just Jed," he replied, grabbing one of her trunks and hefting it over his shoulder. "Come on, best we get moving, before the heat sets in." As they walked away from the station, her steps heavy but determined beside him, Jed couldn't help but feel something shift inside him. A warmth, faint and unfamiliar, crept through the cracks of his loneliness. He couldn't name it, not yet, but it was enough to keep him moving forward. Maggie's first morning at the Thompson homestead began with the sound of roosters crowing and the acrid smell of coffee boiling over a fire that sputtered more than it crackled. The cabin was small, its walls thin and draughty, the floorboards creaking beneath her every step. She rose before dawn, the discomfort of a night spent on a lumpy cot only serving to harden her determination. The place was in a sorry state, but she had seen worse. Jed moved through his chores like a man possessed, his motions clipped and efficient, his expression unreadable. She saw the exhaustion stamped deep into his features, the gauntness that came from too many missed meals and too little rest. But beneath that gruff exterior, Maggie sensed something kinder, though he guarded it as fiercely as a man might protect his gold. Tommy greeted her with a wide, gap-toothed grin, his enthusiasm unfaltering. "You going to be staying, Miss Maggie?" he asked, clutching a wooden toy horse he had whittled from scrap. "For a while, I reckon," she replied, her voice steady. "Long as your pa's willing to have me around." Tommy's smile widened. "I like you here. Pa don't laugh much anymore, but you make him smile. I saw it." Maggie's cheeks warmed. She wasn't sure what to say to that, so she busied herself with finding something useful to do. The kitchen was little more than a corner of the cabin, a rickety table stacked with dented pots and knives worn dull from overuse. She set about cleaning, her hands finding a rhythm in the scrubbing and sorting. The activity calmed her nerves, which buzzed like a hive full of angry bees. She needed to prove herself useful, to show Jed she was worth more than the pity he'd shown her by offering shelter. By midday, she'd swept the cabin, washed the dishes, and patched a tear in Tommy's shirt. Her hands ached, but the ache was a welcome distraction from the gnawing anxiety that clung to her. She had been left behind before, abandoned and humiliated. She would not give Jed any reason to see her as a burden. When Jed returned from the Kaj fields, sweat glistening on his brow and dirt streaked across his arms, she had a meal ready. Simple fare, boiled potatoes and a stew made from the last of the salted pork. His eyes widened slightly as he took in the spread, but he said nothing. Just sat down and ate with the quiet intensity of a man starved. "Good," he muttered between bites. "Real good." Maggie watched him, searching for any sign that her efforts were appreciated. It was hard to read him, his words as measured as his steps, but there was something about the way he shoveled food into his mouth, like he hadn't had a proper meal in months, that made her feel she'd done something right. After supper, Tommy dragged her outside, his energy boundless despite the waning daylight. He showed her the chicken coop, the goat pen, the crooked fence that lined the north pasture. The place was barely holding together, yet it had a rough charm that spoke of hard work and stubbornness. "Pa says it's all going to hell," Tommy admitted, his voice dropping to a whisper. "But I think you can help us fix it. You're strong." Maggie laughed, a deep, rolling sound that startled the boy. "Strong enough, maybe, but it'll take more than muscle to mend what's broken here." "Then you can use your brains, too," Tommy insisted. "Pa says folks are mean to you because you're big, but I think big means you're tougher." Her smile faltered, but she ruffled his hair and nodded. "Maybe you're right, Tommy, maybe you're right." The next few days were a blur of work and aching muscles. Maggie threw herself into the tasks Jed reluctantly allowed her to take on. She mended fences, cleared debris from the fields, and dug a new trench to keep water from pooling near the barn when the rains came. Jed's eyes followed her progress, his expression unreadable, but his silence no longer quite so hostile. Every evening she prepared supper and sat with Jed and Tommy around the rough-hewn table. Conversation remained sparse, but the air grew warmer, less strained. Tommy chattered about his adventures with the chickens or his dreams of one day taming wild horses. Jed listened, though his gaze often drifted to Maggie, his brow creased, as if she were a puzzle he couldn't quite solve. Word of her presence spread quickly through the town, and not all of it kind. When Jed rode into town for supplies, he returned with a clenched jaw and eyes that burned with some unspoken fury. Maggie suspected he'd endured more than his share of insults on her behalf. "Walker's been sniffing around," he told her one evening, his voice tight. "Claims you're some witch putting spells on me and Tommy. Said he saw you working on the fences and swears you got 'em fixed faster than any man could." "Does he believe it, or is he just looking for trouble?" Maggie asked, her fingers clenching around the spoon she was stirring stew with. "Walker's always looking for trouble," Jed replied. "Man's got a grudge against me since I refused to sell him this land years ago. Now that it's falling to pieces, he thinks he can run me off." "Let him think what he wants," Maggie said firmly. "I'm not afraid of him." That's easy to say now. Jed's gaze was sharp, his expression harder than she'd ever seen it. "But Walker's got money and influence. More than you or me. Money doesn't make a man strong, and it sure doesn't make him right." Jed grunted, but there was something like admiration in his eyes. "Maybe, but I'd be a damn fool if I didn't keep my guard up." They continued their work side by side, though often in silence. Maggie discovered a satisfaction in the labor she hadn't expected. The soil was stubborn, the tools dull, but her hands grew calloused and her muscles stronger with each passing day. She found herself laughing more, her voice startling the quiet air around the cabin. Tommy's antics brought smiles from her, his boyish exuberance infectious. Jed softened, though he never acknowledged it outright. She caught him watching her sometimes, his gaze distant and thoughtful. The nights grew colder, But the cabin felt warmer, as if her presence had somehow stoked an old fire back to life. Trouble came just past dawn one frigid morning. Maggie had risen early, her breath fogging the air as she went to fetch water from the creek. She heard the hoofbeats first, a rumble that grew louder until she saw them. A group of riders thundering up the path toward the cabin. Sam Walker at the front, his face twisted into a sneer. "Thompson!" Walker's voice cracked through the chill. "I've come for what's mine." Jed emerged from the cabin, rifle in hand, but pointed at the ground. His eyes narrowed as he took in the riders, his shoulders braced for a fight. "You've got nothing here, Walker. Go back to town." "I've got claims that say otherwise," Walker snapped, holding up a roll of parchment. "You've been squatting on this land long enough. Either pay up or get out. I owe you nothing, maybe not, but that woman you took in, she's got the devil's hand. Folks seen her working your land like a man possessed. That ain't natural, and it sure as hell ain't right." Maggie stepped forward before Jed could respond, her chin lifted defiantly. "I work because it needs doing. If you're scared of a woman doing a man's labor, then maybe it's you who's unnatural." Walker's eyes narrowed, his mouth twisting with disdain. "Keep talking like that, and you'll find yourself burned out of this place. You think you're safe here? I can make things real hard for you, woman." Jed's voice cut through the hair like a blade. "You so much as set foot on my land again, Walker, and I'll make sure you regret it." Walker laughed, but it was a brittle sound, devoid of real humor. "You've made your choice, Thompson, but don't say I didn't. Warn you." The riders turned and left, their threats hanging heavy in the air. Maggie glanced at Jed, her breath catching at the hardness in his gaze. "You didn't have to defend me," she said. Jed's voice was low, his words weighted with a truth she hadn't expected. "Yes, I did." The weeks that followed were a blur of labor and fleeting moments of something like contentment. Maggie threw herself into the work with a determination that verged on desperation. She mended fences, patched the barn's roof where the wind had torn shingles loose, and cleared rocks from the field so the soil could breathe again. Her muscles burned with the effort, her hands growing rough and calloused, but the pain was welcome. It was proof she could contribute, that she wasn't simply some unwanted burden cast upon Jed's dwindling resources. Jed watched her from the corner of his eye, his expression often unreadable. She could sense his suspicion of her strength, his bewilderment at her resilience. She caught him staring on more than one occasion, his gaze curious and calculating, as if he were trying to solve a puzzle he hadn't asked for. And yet, there was something else there too, something softer beneath the harsh exterior he clung to like armor. Tommy was her greatest joy. The boy took to her like a duck to water, following her around the homestead with a boundless energy she envied. He peppered her with questions as she worked, his curiosity insatiable. How had she learned to mend fences so quickly? Why did she know how to drive nails and haul lumber as well as any man? "Back home, my folks had a farm," Maggie told him one afternoon, her voice steady as she pounded nails into the splintered wood of the goat pen. "When my brother died, there wasn't anyone else to do the work, so I learned I had to." Tommy's eyes widened. "But you're a lady. Ain't ladies supposed to wear dresses and sit all pretty?" Maggie laughed, the sound deep and rolling like thunder over the plains. "Some ladies do, but I never much cared for sitting around. I like to keep my hands busy." "You sound like Pa," Tommy said, his voice solemn. "He don't sit much, neither, not unless he's too tired to move." Maggie glanced over her shoulder toward the cabin, where Jed was busy repairing the porch steps. "Your Pa works hard because he loves you. Everything he does is to make sure you have what you need." Tommy nodded, but there was a shadow in his eyes Maggie couldn't quite place. He didn't speak of his mother often, but she'd caught him staring at the willow tree on the hill more than once, his small face drawn with a sadness far too heavy for a child his age. Maggie understood grief's weight better than most. It had chased her across states, gnawing at her insides with a persistence that left her breathless at times. She tried to lighten the boy's spirits with stories, spinning wild tales of knights and dragons as they gathered eggs from the coop or washed clothes in the creek. Tommy loved her stories, his laughter brightening the air like sunlight piercing through storm clouds. He would run to Jed, breathless with excitement, recounting Maggie's latest yarn with all the fervor of a preacher delivering a sermon. Jed's reactions varied. Sometimes he would grunt in acknowledgement, his focus fixed on whatever task lay before him. Other times a smile would flicker across his lips, so brief and fragile Maggie wondered if she had only imagined it. She saw how he looked at her when he thought she wasn't paying attention, his gaze lingering with a mixture of gratitude and something else she couldn't quite name. Maggie tried not to think about her growing affection for him. It was foolish to imagine anything more than what they already had, a tenuous alliance built on necessity and shared hardship. Jed had made no promises, offered no reassurances beyond his grudging acceptance of her presence, but the way he treated her, his careful consideration, even when his words were clipped and brusque, gave her hope. She spent her nights lying awake. On the narrow cot Jed had set up for her in the corner of the cabin. The room was small, their lives crammed together in a space that felt both suffocating and strangely comforting. She could hear Jed's breathing in the darkness, steady and deep, and Tommy's occasional murmurs as he dreamed of horses and heroes. It was a kind of intimacy Maggie had never known, the quiet harmony of living alongside others rather than merely existing in their shadow. Trouble came again in the form of Sam Walker. The man was relentless, his obsession with the Thompson land, growing more dangerous with each passing day. He sent men to harass them, their taunts carrying over the fields like poisoned arrows. They left dead animals by the creek, scrawled threats on the side of the barn, and tried to scare Maggie off with jeers about her size and supposed witchcraft. "You ain't safe here, woman," one of Walker's men had sneered one afternoon, as she hauled a bucket of water up from the well. "Best leave before things get ugly." Maggie met his gaze with a steadiness that sent a chill down the man's spine. "I've dealt with uglier men than you. Now get off this land before I decide to chase you off myself." He left grumbling, but not before spitting into the dirt at her feet. Maggie returned to her chores, her heart pounding with anger and something darker. She had come here for a fresh start, but it seemed trouble had followed her like a curse. Jed confronted Walker one morning after discovering a section of the fence torn down and cattle driven off into the wild. His fury was a palpable thing, his voice low and sharp as he spoke to Maggie before riding off toward town. "I'm going to end this," he said, his eyes like flint. "Walker's gone too far. Stealing livestock, vandalizing the barn. He wants me to break, but I won't give him the satisfaction." "Maybe I should go," Maggie offered, her voice strained. "If it's me he's after, I won't bring any more harm to you or Tommy." Jed's gaze softened, his shoulders relaxing as if the suggestion itself had wounded him. "This ain't your fault, Maggie. Walker's been trying to force me off this land long before you ever showed up. You've been a help to me, to Tommy, and I won't have you running off because of some coward's schemes." "Then let me help you fight," Maggie said, her voice fierce. "You can't do it alone, and neither can I." His lips twitched into something that might have been a smile. "You got more fight in you than most men I know. I reckon I could use the help." They spent the following days reinforcing the fences, setting traps around the perimeter of the property, and stockpiling what little supplies they could afford. Maggie's strength proved invaluable. Her ability to haul lumber and swing a hammer with the same precision as any man impressing even Jed. Their conversations grew more frequent, their silences less fraught with unease. Tommy remained blissfully unaware of the danger that hovered like a storm cloud over their little homestead. His laughter rang out over the fields, his joy a stubborn defiance against the darkness that threatened to consume them all. One evening, after a particularly grueling day of work, Maggie sat on the porch beside Jed, their legs dangling over the edge. The sky had turned a deep velvety blue, the stars shimmering like jewels scattered across dark silk. The air was crisp, a cool breeze rustling the leaves of the willow tree on the hill. "You don't have to stay, you know," Jed said suddenly, his voice so quiet she almost didn't hear him. Maggie glanced at him, her brow furrowing. "Do you want me to leave?" "No," he admitted, his gaze fixed on the horizon. "But I can't ask you to stay either, not when there's so much risk." "You're not asking me to stay. I chose to." She hesitated, her voice lowering. "And not just because I've got nowhere else to go." His eyes met hers then, something raw and vulnerable flickering in their depths. You've made things better around here. The work, the food, Tommy. He's happier with you around, and so am I. Maggie's breath hitched, her heart thundering in her chest. Then I'll stay, she whispered. As long as you want. Fai to. The morning dawned cold and brittle, the air sharp enough to cut skin. Maggie woke to the sound of hoofbeats echoing against the frost-hardened earth, their rhythm urgent and unyielding. She rose from her cot, her bones creaking from the strain of another sleepless night. Jed's warning had been clear. Walker would not rest until the Thompsons were driven from their land. Maggie's presence had only added fuel to the fire, her defiance an affront that Walker would not tolerate. She pulled on her boots and stepped outside to find Jed already saddling his horse. His jaw was clenched, his eyes darkened by the kind of exhaustion that could hollow out a man's soul. Tommy hovered nearby, clutching his wooden horse with knuckles turned white from the cold. "What's happening?" Maggie asked, her voice rough from disuse. Walker's men tore down the fences again, drove the cattle off and left tracks clear as day, like they wanted me to know who did it. Jed's voice was a snarl, his fury barely contained. Maggie's fists clenched at her sides. "You can't keep going after them alone. They'll kill you if you push them too far. Better to die fighting than let that bastard steal what's mine," Jed snapped, though his anger wasn't truly aimed at her. "I'll head out and see if I can catch up to them before they reach the river. I'm coming with you." The words left her mouth before she'd even fully considered them, but there was no mistaking her resolve. Jed turned to face her, his eyes narrowing. "You'll do no such thing. This is my fight." "It's ours," she corrected, her voice firm. "How you said it yourself, I've been a help to you. Well, let me help you now. We can't keep playing defense while Walker tears this place apart piece by piece." Jed looked at her for a long moment, his expression unreadable. Finally he nodded, though his shoulders remained tense. "Fine, but you stay behind me, and if anything goes wrong, you get the hell out of there. Understand?" Maggie met his gaze with unwavering determination. "I'm not running, Jed. Not from this." They rode out together, the frigid air biting at their faces as they followed the trail of broken fences and scattered hoofprints. The landscape stretched out before them in a harsh, unforgiving sprawl of dust and rock. Maggie's muscles ached from the strain of gripping the reins, but she pushed the discomfort aside. There was no room for weakness, not now. They found the cattle near the river, the animals clustered in a confused, restless huddle. Two of Walker's men were standing by the water's edge, rifles slung over their shoulders and sneers plastered across their faces. Well, one of them drawled, his voice thick with condescension. "Looks like Thompson brought himself a bodyguard. And a woman, no less." Maggie slid from her horse, her boots crunching against the frost-bitten grass. "You boys best start walking before I decide to give you a lesson in manners." The men exchanged glances, their amusement turning to something far uglier. The taller of the two stepped forward, his hand resting on the butt of his rifle. "You're a mouthy one, ain't ya?" he sneered. "Maybe you need to be taught your place." Jed's voice cut through the air like a blade. "Touch her, and you'll be picking your teeth out of the dirt." The man hesitated, but arrogance outweighed caution. He took another step forward, his grin widening. "Ain't nobody here but you and the lady. Walker's got more men than you could ever handle, and I reckon he'll pay us a pretty penny to drag you back to him, broken and bleeding." Maggie saw the flash of movement before Jed did, the other man lifting his rifle with deadly intent. Without thinking, she grabbed the shotgun strapped to her saddle and fired. The blast echoed across the riverbank, the recoil jolting her arms with brutal force. The man's rifle clattered to the ground as he fell, his scream splintering the air. The taller man's expression twisted from confidence to terror. He reached for his weapon, but Jed was quicker. A single shot from his revolver sent the man sprawling, blood staining the frost beneath him. For a moment, silence hung heavy and absolute. Maggie's breathing came in ragged gasps, her heart pounding, so loudly she could scarcely hear anything else. She glanced at Jed, his face pale but composed, his eyes glinting with something between respect and fear. "Damn, Maggie," he breathed. "You just saved my life." She swallowed, her throat tight. Had to be done. They gathered the cattle, driving them back toward the homestead with an urgency born of necessity. Neither of them spoke much on the ride back, their silence weighted by the violence that had erupted so suddenly. Maggie's hands trembled around the reins, her mind replaying the moment of the gun's discharge over and over, until it became little more than a blur of sound and motion. When they reached the cabin, Tommy ran out to meet them, his expression a mixture of relief and confusion. Maggie slid from her horse, her legs weak and unsteady. She tried to hide the tremors from Tommy's watchful eyes, but the boy was sharper than most. "Did you catch the bad men?" he asked, his voice small and brittle. Jed nodded, his voice gentle. "We did. And they won't be bothering us anymore." Tommy looked to Maggie, his eyes wide and searching. "Are you hurt?" "No, Tommy. Just tired." Maggie forced a smile. But it felt like a lie even as the words left her mouth. The days that followed were tense and filled with preparation. Maggie and Jed reinforced the fences, stockpiled ammunition, and made sure the barn was secured against any further attempts at sabotage. Walker's presence loomed over them like a dark cloud, his influence infecting the town like a sickness. The townsfolk grew distant, their eyes avoiding Maggie whenever she ventured into the general store or the post office. The whispers followed, her everywhere cruel words slithering between the cracks of civility. She bore the scorn with as much dignity as she could muster, but the weight of it grew heavier with each passing day. Jed remained steadfast, his loyalty unshaken by the gossip that swirled around them. His affection for her had grown into something solid and unspoken, a bond forged through shared hardship and quiet understanding. They spent their evenings together on the porch, their conversations growing longer and less guarded. Maggie found herself drawn to Jed's stubborn kindness, his rough edges softened by moments of unexpected gentleness. He spoke of Sarah with reverence, his voice thick with the pain of loss, but also gratitude for what he had once known. She'd have liked you, Jed said one night, his gaze fixed on the horizon. You've got the same fire she did, the same damn determination to keep on going no matter how hard the world tries to break you. I'm not trying to replace her, Maggie whispered, her fingers twisting nervously in her lap. Jed shook his head. I know, and that's what makes it matter. You're here because you choose to be, not because anyone asked you to. The moment stretched out between them, raw and exposed. Maggie felt the tears burning behind her eyes, but she held them back. She couldn't afford to be vulnerable, not when the world seemed so determined to tear her down. The final confrontation came 3 days later. Walker and his men rode onto the property with rifles drawn and cruelty etched into their faces. Maggie stood beside Jed, her shotgun clutched tightly in her hands. This time, there would be no retreat, no negotiation. The gunfire was a storm, deafening and merciless. Maggie fired until her arms ached, her vision blurring from the smoke and adrenaline. Walker's men fell one by one, their arrogance undone by desperation. Walker himself was the last to fall, his eyes wide with disbelief as Jed's bullet tore through him. When the dust settled, Maggie stood trembling but unbroken. The land was theirs, finally and completely. And as Jed pulled her into his arms, his embrace fierce and unyielding, she knew that she had found something worth fighting for, something worth holding on to.